To do that, I should talk a little bit about where I came from. I grew up in Bakersfield, California. I don't know if anybody knows where Bakersfield is. Yes? No?
I'm from Bakersfield.
What?
Born and raised.
You're from Bakersfield?
Yes, sir.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. I was going to say some things about Bakersfield, but now I can't say it. It's an oil and agriculture town at the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley, made famous by John Steinbeck when he wrote Bridge of Wrath. It's the terminus of the Gospel of Migration. Of course, the book was banned in the Bakersfield Library up until the 1950s, so it gives you a little sense of the community. My father was a rabbi there, my mother was a teacher, and I finished high school there in 1960, and determined to go about as far from Bakersfield as I possibly could, came to Harvard as an undergraduate, which was a very intimidating place to come. I mean, there were schools I'd never heard of, associations and relationships I could only imagine, and a level of privilege that just was really new to me. But it was also a very exciting time. John Kennedy was elected president that fall. I came to the Yard shortly after he was elected. We issued this call for a new generation of leadership here. It sort of felt like we were in the center of the world. When 10% of the faculty disappeared and went to Washington to work with this administration, yeah, it felt like being in the center of the world. For me, it led to getting involved in the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement was bursting out all over at that time, 63, 64. And I got involved in civil rights, I think, for three reasons. We had lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War when my father was a chaplain in the American Army. And his work was primarily with Holocaust survivors. And as a child, the Holocaust was like too great a horror, I think, to grasp for anyone, but certainly for a small child. Well, what was clear was that there were people who had experienced a horror who were on their way, hopefully looking for something else, something new. A lot of those people would pass through our house. And my parents were very clear about the Holocaust in the sense that my mother, having grown up in Virginia, had a very strong sensitivity to questions of race and interpreted it more as a consequence of racism than simply of anti-Semitism. So I was raised with the belief that racism was simply an evil, period. Had evil consequences, and evil things. So civil rights came along, well, that was all about. Secondly, I was raised on Passover Seders. How many of you have ever been to a Passover Seder? How many of you would like to go to one? In the Jewish tradition, the Passover Seder is a reenactment of the Exodus story, of the story of journey from slavery to freedom. And as a child, you're told that this is something that didn't just happen 3,000 years ago, but it's something that happened for you now. I found that very puzzling. Wait, what does this have to do with me? This is 3,000. And after a while, I began to get it, that this story, the story of the move from slavery to freedom, is something that doesn't happen once, it happens all the time. And whether we look at it in terms of our own lives, the lives of our communities, or in terms of the lives of our countries or our peoples, this is an ongoing process, struggle. And so the question you face is, where do you stand in relation to this? What do you do in relation to this? And so the civil rights movement was obviously about that. Thirdly, it was a movement of young people. Dr. King, when he ran the Montgomery bus boycott, you know how old was? Anybody know? 26. How many people are over 20? No, I won't ask. I love this last line of the Mary Oliver poem where she says, "And what have you done with your one wild and precious life?" So it's kind of a good thing about it. 26. It was a movement of young people. 17, 18, 19, 20, people that were doing the sit-ins, the bus boycott, the freedom rides, and so forth. And so for someone, these were my peers. And so for people who shared values that I did, for them to be acting on it and me not became sort of a question I had to ask myself, like, well, how come? Especially because there was a kind of joyfulness in their engagement with this struggle that was very appealing. It wasn't just, oh, hard, awful, but there was a real kind of celebratory spirit. And so the first time I went to Atlanta, Georgia, and went to a staff meeting, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I think I was a goner. I wound up volunteering with the Mississippi Summer Project and going to Mississippi summer of 1964. one thing, it was very clear that the inequalities we were dealing with of health, education, criminal justice, you name it, it couldn't be dealt with in isolation because they were all functions of a deeper inequality. And that inequality was an inequality of power. And that unless we addressed the question of power, we were just dealing with symptoms. The African American community could not vote, had no political power, economically was marginalized, and culturally, I'd never had the experience of going to someone twice my age who was sitting in a chair, who would stand up, offer me his chair, call me Mr., introduce himself by his first name, and not look me in the eye because he was black and I was white. I hadn't had that kind of experience before. And I learned from it that inequality was being reproduced in every single encounter between black and white in that context. So I learned some things about power and the need to tackle the power question. I learned about the fact that you couldn't go find power, that if you asked the powerful for power, they were not likely to give it to you. And so you had to go to the people with the problem and figure out how to work with them so as to turn their resources into power, in the way that the bus boycott transformed individual bus fare into collective power. In relation to the bus company, I'm referring to Rosa Parks and all that, which we celebrated last year. And finally, it alerted me to the importance of leadership in bringing communities together to enable them to capture their resources and transform them into power in that way. So it's sort of shaped my thinking for the next, probably till now, in terms of the relationship of power, community, and leadership. Now within that, it was very clear that there was a very important resource that this community was drawing on with which to make it struggle. And I'm not talking about money, and I'm not talking about political influence, although those things certainly matter without. But there was a kind of moral energy that movement was infused with that was rooted very much in the church, and very much in the sense that this was part of a struggle that in fact went back a long way. I mean, we even used the Exodus language, and that was going to go forward a long way. And so it drew my attention to that facet of things, that it isn't enough just to have smart strategy, but you have to have the motivation, the capacity for sacrifice, for commitment, in order to make those strategies actually happen and real. I left the South after a year and a half, went back to Bakersfield, where Cesar Chavez had just started a grape strike 30 miles from where I grew up. He was interested in people who worked in the civil rights movement. I had grown up in the middle of the world, but I'd never seen it. I had to come here, and more importantly to Mississippi, to get educated about race, politics, and power in America. And a lot of us talk about going to Mississippi thinking it was an exception to America, and leaving realizing it was an example, because the inequality was so stark and so clear and so in your face, you couldn't ignore it. So I went back to Bakersfield with what we called Mississippi eyes. I was able to see the migrant farm worker world for the first time, and see the ways in which it was very similar to the fight that we've been fighting in the South. And it was also a world that drew powerful moral resources from its faith traditions, cultural traditions, and so forth. I did that for the next 16 years up until 1981. And if the vocation I got was in the South, I got really craft with farm workers. We did all kinds of organizing, political organizing. My first campaign was Bobby Kennedy in 1968. We did the Get Out the Vote in East Los Angeles, where non-citizens went to turn out the votes of citizens in the election and do it successfully. In 1981, I left the farm workers, did another 10 years of union issue electoral work, mostly in California, and then got invited to my 25th reunion at Harvard, even though I'd never graduated and had a year left to go. Now, they figured that 25 years out, you've made enough money that you're ready to come back and share some of it. And they weren't right in my case, but in a lot of cases they are. I'd never come to a reunion, but I came, and it was as if kind of a cross-generational encounter with myself, reflecting on how I'd been when I left, where I was. And it really piqued my appetite for going much deeper and broader into the work I've been doing for the last 28 years before that. So in 1991, my wife Susan and I came back here. I finished my senior year in college, wrote a senior thesis in history and government, graduated class of 64-92, and then we both came here as mid-careers the following fall. I think maybe the only person who went from senior to mid-career in one summer. So we did the mid-career program here, and while here we did some organizing here, challenged the school a bit on its mission and its quality of its teaching and some other things, and then decided to do PhDs, one in sociology and Susan's in management at Sloan. And so as I started doing this work on a PhD, I was asked to teach here, to put together a course on organizing. And for me, it was a perfect way to integrate my life experience with the academic work that I was doing. And I guess they asked me to teach here, I could only surmise it had something to do with the success of our organizing before. And they figured, you know, better to co-opt this guy than they have now. So I don't know. That's one possible theory. In any event, I finished the PhD in 2000 and was appointed to the faculty here. And since then, I have been teaching organizing and similar related courses. So this is one origin of the course, of this course. Because in my years of organizing, I learned that two key elements combine in leadership, more than two. These two are both critical. On the one hand, creative strategy, in the spirit of David and Goliath. Advocates of change always have to figure out how to do more with less. Okay? That's just the nature of things. Because non-change always has more resources. And so those who are trying to produce change wind up having to be more resourceful. And so have to compensate for lack of resources with resourcefulness, as in the David and Goliath story. In being more resourceful, however, motivation becomes a critical factor. In the spirit of Dr. King, in social movements and in movements for change, the depth of motivation, the strength of commitment, the capacity to sacrifice, the ability to mobilize your imagination is in fact what fuels effective strategy. So in other words, it's not like there's strategy and then there's, you know, values over here. It's much more, they're interconnected, especially if you're dealing with questions of social change. So that moral energy, hopefulness, turns out to be a critical element in strategy. So there's a linking of the two. And when I came back to school, I learned that, that this distinction, in fact, reflected two ways of knowing, two ways of looking at the world, which Jerome Bruder writes about in the piece that we assigned for this time. On the one hand, strategy is in the what he calls the logical empirical domain, where we can answer questions of how, what's most efficient, what's most probable, how can we make the best use of our resources. On the other hand, motivation is in the what he calls the emotive or moral world, where we have to go to answer questions of why. Why does it matter? Why do we care? Why is it important? Why do we value it? Why are we willing? Why should we risk acting? And that's the domain more of possibility than of probability, and that's the domain of narrative. So, digging deeper into this question of narrative, I found that through narrative interactions, that we actually learn how to make choices, that we learn to exercise agency in the face of uncertainty, which is when agency really counts. We learn how to articulate our values with respect to those choices. Not only articulate them, but draw upon them in order to face choices. And how to connect our sources of motivation, what Charles Taylor calls our moral sources, to action in the world. So that through narrative interaction and narrative transaction, we learn not only what we ought to do, or what we think others ought to do, but we can actually acquire the emotional resources to be able to do it. Or as St. Augustine said, it's not enough to know the good, but one has to love the good if one is to act in relation to the good. So that there is this important emotional, motivational element of moral action. Now, public narrative, and we're going to get a chance to dig into all this. This is just sort of my opening wrap here. Public narrative not surprisingly, is about acting in public, right? As Hannah Arendt writes in the piece that we asked you to read this time. If we're to be public actors, if we are to undertake public work, we are expected, required, I think, to give a moral account of ourselves. Who are we in terms of what we value? What has made us who we are? What is the cause we serve? What action will we call upon others to take, and why can they have confidence in us or not? Now, anybody who wants to take a look at American politics for the last however many years, see the obviousness of this. To the extent that candidates are unable to explain who they are, they become a tabula rasa that their opponents paint as whom they wish them to be. And that's my essential claim about public storytelling, that if you are in public life, you have a responsibility to author your own public story in a way that people can understand who you are and where you're coming from, because otherwise, they'll do it for you. And guess what? They may not do it in ways you like. Does this make sense? So the subject that we're going to work on is, therefore, public storytelling. And we're going to look at it in terms of self, the story I must present of who I am. Us, the story I articulate of the community within which I'm speaking. And a story of now, the way in which this moment is a moment that calls for action, okay? That calls for choice and action. Now, I want to be clear that this is not a class in public speaking. And Tim McCarthy does a great job teaching communications. He's a great speaker. This is not public speaking, okay? Its content may be speaking. I mean, the form it takes may, in fact, be speech. Of course, it is words. But what I want to work with you on is rather the content of what you're saying than how you say it. My belief is that if you are anchored into your own understanding of what moves you to act, you're going to find ways to communicate that to others in authentic and powerful ways. So this is not about messaging. It's not about packaging. It's not about messaging. It's not about all the frills to make something look like something it isn't. It's rather how to give voice to what is, to what's within your heart, what's within the hearts of others, so that from that, the energy can be generated to act on those values. Is that clear? So we're going to be doing a lot of talking, but this is what we're going to be talking about. One last thought just before, how am I doing? This time thing is always, one final thought just before moving on, about not just why I'm interested in public narrative, but why I decided to learn to teach it. Because this is the first time this course has been taught, so you're all guinea pigs. I mean, we all are. We're going to learn how to do this together. And I sort of faced this dilemma of like, well, should I keep it to the 12 or 15 students I thought would be interested? You know, that way be very controllable and know exactly what we're doing. And it just seemed to me that that didn't make sense. It seemed to me that the level of interest says something very important. And that we should try to respond to that. So we're going to be learning, all of us, in the course of the next 7 weeks about how to do this. So bring an exploratory spirit to what we're doing together. But in terms of why I decided to learn to teach it, I think there's two reasons. One, my wife Susan, who taught with me here, because we both joined the faculty at the same time, died of leukemia 3 years ago. And, you know, something like that happens, you go into a period of a lot of reflection. And so I did a lot of thinking about, you know, my particular journey and where I was and where I was going and what to do. And it seemed like, ironically, at the same time that I was doing that, I seemed to become more conscious of what felt like a real moral crisis in our country. Not to project the personal on the global. I like to think of it that I just perhaps became more sensitive to what seemed to be happening. That the public narratives that have shaped our public life for the last 30 or 40 years are fracturing, or have fractured, creating a kind of vacuum in which an increasingly individualistic and market-driven society becomes more and more vulnerable to competing forms of fundamentalism, few of which offer ways to find the courage to embrace the tolerance, empathy, and kindness that I think we urgently need in our public life. Now, we're not going to solve this in the next 7 weeks, but I'd like to think that by engaging with this question of public narrative, we can at least become part of the solution. That by learning to better connect with and articulate those values that move us, we can inject into our public life a kind of refreshment, a moral refreshment that I think it desperately